Hey, good afternoon, class. Welcome in. We are going to dive into two areas that we really haven't looked at too much. We're going to take a look at India and China today, and we're going to look at British influence and essentially the reactions by both India and China. Again, these are some very important reactions and things that are going to build up into the 20th century. So, on this first image, what we see is a naval battle between China and Great Britain. This is going to be during the Opium Wars, and you can see, again, a distinct advantage in technologies. You used to have these steam-powered steel ships that the British have versus the old wooden ships the Chinese have, and these are going to be battles that the British are going to have the upper hand in. So we'll see that as a common theme here. Once again, we're seeing foreign intervention in these new areas in this idea of imperialism. So let's go and let's get into this. Again, officially, the British government regulated the East India Company efforts in both London and in India. For several years, minimal interference was conducted. The company had its own army, all right? This was led by British officers and Indian soldiers known as sepoys, all right? British businessmen and government officials had a growing concern that the sepoys may turn against them one day. At first, the British treasured India more for its potential than the actual profits. However, after the Industrial Revolution, when there's becoming more of a need, Britain would consider India to be what they called the jewel of the crown. All right, in other words, the most valuable of all of the British colonies. The British would set up restrictions that prevented India from operating its own economy. Competition against British goods in India was prohibited as well. So if you were to come up with your own company, you could not compete against the British company. That was forbidden. Now, India became increasingly valuable to the British after a railroad network had been established. All right, here, goods could be sent from the interior to the coastal ports and back and forth. The majority of the goods that were being transported were agricultural products that included tea, indigo, coffee, cotton, and jute. Jute is used in rope making. Now, the railroads brought about positives and negatives for India. On one hand, the railroad did allow India to modernize with education, communication, and infrastructure. However, on the other hand, none of these Indian-owned companies were allowed to profit. Okay, so if you had started up your own company, all those profits are going to the British. All the money funneled to the British, and this is where we start seeing famine and starvation begin to occur. Lastly, the British were supposed to have a hands-off policy when it came to Indian religions and customs, but Christian missionaries and very racist attitudes from British officials would threaten everyday life for the Indian people. So you have, again, Christian missionaries trying to impose Christianity. You have very racist British officers who are throughout the country. They are making their way into Indian life, and they, again, are not happy with it. So by 1850, again, the British had controlled most of the Indian subcontinent. All right. However, there were several pockets of discontent and resentment. The Indian people were furious about British attempts to convert them to Christianity and the constant racism that they endured every day. They were furious at both of these aspects. With economic problems increasing in 1857, so did their feelings of nationalism. You start seeing a people that want to unify and nationalize India. In one instance, sepoys were ordered to bite off gun cartridges in a training exercise that were actually laced with beef and pork fat. Remember, Hindus see cows as being sacred, and Muslims do not eat pork. Sepoys of both religions were enraged and refused the commands to use the cartridges. Those who disobeyed were punished and jailed. As a result, the Sepoy Mutiny was underway. And here, across all of India, mostly in the northern part of India, the British and the Sepoy armies tried to slaughter one another until the British government intervened. After this event, the British would take direct command of India. The term Raj refers to the time in which Indian people fell under British rule. Princes and local leaders who remained loyal to the crown would remain independent. Yet, British influence would seep into these regions more and more. This is that classic protectorate model, okay, that we talked about in our first discussion. Now, this is an image here of the Sepoy Mutiny. Again, these were soldiers who were loyal to the crown, but after some of these religious offenses, they started taking it upon themselves to fight against the British. Now, nationalism is going to start surfacing in India. In the 1800s, early on, some Indians demanded more modernization and the ability to govern themselves. Over time, leaders would emerge and have an influence on nationalistic attitudes. One such leader, early on in the 1800s, was by the name of Ram Mohan Roy. And Roy felt that arranged child marriages and the caste system should be changed. That these policies were outdated, they should be modified. He felt that if traditional changes weren't made, India will continue to be controlled by others, and outsiders is what he was essentially referring to. Now, in the early 1900s, a man by the name of Mohandas Gandhi is going to take it upon himself to fight for Swaraj, or self-rule. Now, he was a human rights activist. He wanted to resist against British control, which he's going to do. We'll talk more about him later on. Fought for women's rights, wanted religious harmony, and wanted to end untouchability. Remember, the untouchables being part of that caste system, he does not want to see that anymore. These people, the poor, the needy, he felt should be helped and not just left to suffer. He would become leader of the Indian National Congress in 1921, and he would make a heroic push for Indian independence. We're going to see in our last discussion some of the results of imperialism, and we'll talk about Gandhi and his fate in our next discussion. Again, here is Roy, and here is Gandhi in our images. Okay, now let's talk about China. We really haven't talked about China much, and we want to kind of introduce where they're at. So out of the pride for their ancient culture, China looked down and rejected all foreigners heading into the 1800s. They wanted that isolationism. Okay, China was self-sufficient. This meant they could provide for themselves and not rely on exports from other countries. China had extensive mining, agricultural resources. Silk, cotton, and porcelain were also highly valuable and abundant throughout China. For generations, the only port that the Chinese allowed trade was at Guangzhou. And at Guangzhou, the balance of trade here favored China. What does this mean? China earned much more for its exports than it did in terms of spending on its imports. European merchants were determined to find a product that the Chinese would buy in bulk. This happened to be opium. So opium comes from the poppy plant. All right, it is a narcotic and highly addictive and have been used by the Chinese as a painkiller for generations. Morphine can be extracted from opium, and this eventually can be turned into heroin. British merchants began to smuggle opium, basically smuggle it in for non-medical usage. And by 1835, nearly 12 million Chinese people were addicted to opium. Okay, now this is going to lead to further issues between the British and the Chinese. The growing supply of opium caused great problems for China. The emperor of the Qing dynasty even sent a letter to Queen Victoria to stop the trade. Great Britain refused, and an open clash between the British and the Chinese occurred. China's outdated ships were no match for the steam-powered ships that the British had. The Treaty of Nanjing was signed in 1942. This treaty basically gave British people in this area the island of Hong Kong and paved the way for more outside intervention. After signing another treaty in 1844, the U.S. and other foreign nations gained extraterritorial rights. What does this mean? Under this treaty, foreign nations were not subject to Chinese rule at Guangzhou and 4 other ports. The opium trade would continue, and more of China opened up to the west. And again, here's an image again of the 2 fleets going at it in one of the Chinese ports off of Hong Kong. Now, with a booming population nearing 430 million people by 1850, China had internal problems develop as well. Food production barely increased. This led to famine and hunger, and people became discouraged, and opium addiction would skyrocket. To make matters more complicated, a rebel movement that pushed for a sharing of China's wealth and an elimination of poverty erupted. This was known as the Taiping Rebellion. Hong Sheshuan would create a massive following and army. This army would control large parts of southeast China and the city of Nanjing. Hong would leave leadership into the hands of his subordinates, and this would lead to the Taiping downfall. So after he steps away, his subordinates can't really carry the torch. Soon, Qing forces, along with British and French troops, would expel the Taiping. In total, between 20 to 40 million people would die in this conflict. With growing interference from outside nations, many people within China began to resist and revolt against the Qing dynasty. Most groups wanted to modernize, while the Qing wanted to remain traditional. This led to a backlash. A group of poor peasants and workers resented foreign influence in Christianity. In particular, this group was known as the Boxers. Many of these folks had fighting backgrounds. They were well versed in martial arts, and they're going to rebel against any kind of foreign influence. Really, again, they wanted to fend off Christianity. They did not want to accept any of the Western ways, and a multinational force of 19,000 troops would put down the rebellion in 1900. Multinational, again, these other nations felt that their exports and imports could be threatened by this group, so that's why you see an effort to put down the Boxer Rebellion. Despite the failures of this rebellion, it is now evident and it was now clear that nationalism was growing in China. The people of China wanted to resist foreign interference, and they felt that their government needed to be responsive to their needs. Okay, and that's going to lead to, again, some very, very interesting developments in the 20th century for China. As we take a look here, again, this is an image of the Boxer Rebellion. Okay, the Boxer people fighting not only the Chinese, but also people from other nations. Okay? All right, folks, so again, I appreciate that. You're going to take one last look. It's our last journal log for this unit, and that'll wrap things up. And again, we're going to continue working on our projects. I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you next time. Bye, everyone.